types of muscle in the body. Cardiac muscle is involuntary. It does have striations. It's found in the heart. It pumps the blood. Smooth muscle is also involuntary. We don't consciously control it. It does not have striations. It is found lining organs like your stomach and intestines. It's also found lining many blood vessels. Skeletal muscle is the one that's voluntary. It's the one that we consciously control. It moves our bones. It has striations, as you can see, and that is the muscle type that this chapter is primarily focusing on. So let's go ahead and look at the parts of a skeletal muscle fiber. So a muscle fiber is just another name for a muscle cell. They're very long. Well, not very long, but compared to most cells, they're pretty long. Can be around 3 centimeters, which seems really small, but compared to a microscopic cell, it's really long. So that's why they're referred to as muscle fibers. So a muscle fiber is just a muscle cell. The endomysium. So if you look around that muscle fiber, there's the endomysium. That's a connective tissue layer that surrounds each individual muscle fiber, and it electrically insulates them. A fascicle is just a group of muscle fibers, and then each fascicle is surrounded by a perimysium, which is another connective tissue layer. And then the epimysium surrounds the entire muscle, and then the endomysium, the perimysium, and the epimysium, they come together at the end of the muscle and form the tendon, which attaches it to the bone. Now we're going to look closer at a muscle cell or a fiber. So the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of the muscle cell, and it is specialized for sending electrical signals, which we'll talk about later. Myofibrils are these cylindrical organelles that you see. Those are the things that actually contract to make the muscle shorten. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is bluish in this figure. It stores calcium. It releases calcium when we need the muscle to contract. Myofilaments are proteins found inside the myofibril, and their interactions cause the muscle to contract. And then the transverse tubules are the green, kind of a lime green color here, not the bean-shaped things, but the things wrapped around the myofibrils. So transverse tubules are an extension of the plasma membrane. And so the electrical signal is going to spread down the sarcolemma, and then it's going to go down the T-tubules, and they're going to go down to the deepest part of the muscle cell. So that way the myofibrils in the very center of this muscle fiber and the ones on the outside are going to get the signal to contract at the same time. So the whole muscle fiber contracts together. Alright, next is a question. So a single muscle cell is called and the correct answer is B, it's a muscle fiber. Alright, next is the structure and function of myosin and actin. So on the top here we have myosin in purple. If you look at just one individual myosin molecule, it looks sort of like a golf club with 2 heads, and they wrap around and form like a cylinder, so that way there's heads on all sides of it. And those heads are going to reach out and grab onto the actin when we want the muscle to contract. Actin is at the bottom here, and it's this blue globular protein, and it's not really blue, but it forms what's called filamentous actin, which you see here. It also has troponin and tropomyosin, which are regulatory proteins, which we'll talk about in a bit. And actin and myosin together allow the muscle to contract. is the sliding filament model of contraction, so we're going to watch this video.
Skeletal muscle consists of bundles of tiny myofibrils that run the length of the muscle. Myofibrils consist of even finer fibers called myofilaments. They are arranged in a type of latticework to form units called sarcomeres. There are two types of myofilaments, thin and thick. Thick myofilaments are made of a protein called myosin, whereas thin myofilaments consist of a protein called actin. Thin myofilaments are attached to Z-discs. When a muscle begins to contract, the myosin heads latch onto the actin myofilaments, forming what is known as a cross bridge. The myosin heads propel the actin myofilaments forward toward the center of the sarcomere. Because the actin myofilaments are attached to the Z-discs, they pull the Z-discs closer together, shortening the sarcomere. As the sarcomere shortens, so does the myofibril and the entire muscle. Keep in mind that the myofilaments do not shorten. They stay the same length. The sarcomere shortens because the filaments slide over the top of one another.
Okay, so the sliding filament model is what we use to explain muscle contraction, and you can see here the thick filaments, the myosin, is sort of purple in this figure, and then the actin is in green down here. And when the muscle contracts, the myosin doesn't move, the actin is going to slide towards the center, and as both of those slide towards the center, the sarcomere shortens, and that causes the whole myofibril to shorten, and that causes the whole muscle cell to shorten, and that causes the entire muscle to shorten. So they slide past each other, and that's why it's called the sliding filament model of contraction. Alright, next we need to know why muscle contraction requires ATP. And so muscle goes through something called this cross-bridge cycle, where these myosin has to reach out and grab the actin, and then it does its little power stroke where it moves, and that causes the actin to slide. And then ATP comes in and binds to the myosin, and that causes it to release from the actin. And then that ATP powers the myosin head resetting or recharging itself so that it can do this again. So the ATP allows the myosin to release from the actin and reset itself. And then the reason the muscle contraction requires calcium, normally when the muscle cell's at rest, we have these troponin and tropomyosin proteins, and they are covering up the myosin binding sites on actin, so myosin can't bind to actin. When calcium is released, it binds to troponin, which then moves the tropomyosin out of the way, and now we can see here the myosin binding sites are exposed, and the myosin can bind to actin. So next we're going to watch this animation on muscle contraction.
A skeletal muscle must be stimulated by a nerve, specifically a motor neuron, to contract. The connection between a motor neuron and a muscle fiber is called a neuromuscular junction. Between the end of the motor nerve and the muscle fiber is a narrow space called the synaptic cleft. When an impulse reaches the end of a motor neuron, it causes small vesicles to release a chemical messenger, or neurotransmitter, called acetylcholine, into the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine quickly diffuses across the synaptic cleft, where it stimulates receptors in the sarcolemma, the membrane surrounding reflexes.
Okay. So, again, how a muscle fibers contracts. First step is this impulse or electrical signal is going to reach the end of the motor neuron, and it causes these vesicles to fuse with the cell membrane, and they release the neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, or ACH for short. Our skeletal muscles are always going to use acetylcholine. The next step, this ACH diffuses across the synaptic cleft, and there it's going to bind to receptors on the muscle cell. Then the third step, this sends an electrical impulse over the sarcolemma and inward along the T-tubules. This is going to cause the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. And then the fourth step, the calcium is going to bind with the troponin on the actin filament to expose the attachment points. And then the myosin heads can grab onto the thin filaments and muscle contraction can occur. And then the way the muscle fibers relax, when the nerve impulses stop coming, ACH is no longer released. The enzyme acetylcholinesterase will break down any remaining ACH, and calcium ions are pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So with the calcium removed, troponin and tropomyosin prevent the myosin heads from binding to the actin, and the muscle fiber relaxes. Alright, now we have a couple disorders we need to know about. The first is botulism. So, caused by the bacteria Clostridium botulinum, which blocks the release of acetylcholine, and if we can't release acetylcholine, that's what starts the whole process. If we can't release that, then muscles can't contract, and when our breathing muscles don't work, we die. Myasthenia gravis is the next one. This is an autoimmune disease where the body produces antibodies against receptors for ACH, and if those antibodies bind to the receptors, then ACH can't bind to them, so we can't get the signal from the nerve to the muscle, and that causes muscular weakness. Next one is tetanus or lockjaw. This comes from Clostridium tetani, and this causes the motor neurons to fire too much. The muscles are overstimulated, so you get muscle spasms and sustained contractions, and the jaw muscles are typically affected first. That's why it's called lockjaw. And if your jaw muscles are clenched shut, it's hard to eat or drink. Curare is not really a disorder, but this is what is used on poison arrows. It's used in anesthesia to relax the skeletal muscles. It binds to ACH receptor sites, and that way the ACH can't bind, so the muscle can't work. So it causes paralysis of those muscles. So if you have this, you have to be on a ventilator to breathe for you. Alright. Now a question. During muscle contraction, the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases which substance? And it releases calcium. Alright, next we need to know what a motor unit is. It is a neuron and all the fibers it stimulates. So in this picture here we have a blue motor neuron, and it stimulates those two blue muscle fibers. And then we have a red motor neuron, and it stimulates those four red muscle fibers. Alright, we need to know where small and large motor units are found. So this figure shows small and large motor units. So small motor units are in places where we need more precise control, such as like your eye muscles or your finger muscles. Large motor units are going to be found in places like your back or your legs, where you're more concerned with strength than with precision. Alright, next thing is about muscle fiber types. So we have slow twitch muscle fibers. These are the ones that they look red in this picture. They're going to have lots of mitochondria, good blood supply. like sprinters, those muscles do fine for 10 seconds or however long your sprint lasts. And then the slow twitch muscles, they're going to be slower to generate tension, but they're not going to fatigue as fast. The fast twitch muscles are going to fatigue very rapidly. Alright, next thing is how the nervous system controls the force of contraction for skeletal muscles. So basically we can change the frequency of the stimulus or the strength of the stimulus. When a muscle contracts several times in a row, the last contraction is stronger than the first. This is because not all the calcium is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So if we increase the frequency of stimulation, we're going to get more tension or force from that muscle. The other way is by changing the intensity. So we can see on the left, a strong stimulus is going to activate all three of these motor units, the red one, the green one, and the purple one. Whereas on the right, a weaker stimulus just activates the red motor unit. So a stronger stimulus can activate more motor units and generate more force. A weaker stimulus will activate fewer motor units and generate less force. The types of contraction are isometric. Isometric contractions are when the length of the muscle does not change. Isotonic contractions are when the length of the muscle does change. Alright, we need to know how skeletal muscle gets its energy. So at rest, muscles are using fatty acids, and they're using aerobic respiration. That takes oxygen, but at rest you should have plenty of oxygen. In the beginning of exercise, you start to run out of oxygen. So the first thing you're going to use is your creatine phosphate. That helps you regenerate ATP, but we only have enough of that to last us for about 20 seconds. As exercise continues, we're going to use glucose, and we're going to switch to anaerobic respiration since we don't have enough oxygen. This produces lactic acid as a byproduct, which is not a good thing. It makes us sore and it makes our muscles fatigue. But after about 10 minutes of moderate activity, our lungs and our heart should be able to catch up and get us enough oxygen we need to switch to aerobic respiration and use aerobic respiration to break down glucose. The next thing we need to know is the oxygen debt. So following strenuous exercise, lactic acid is going to be converted back to glucose in the liver. The extra oxygen that's needed to process or convert this lactic acid is called an oxygen debt. So that's why after running a race you still might be breathing hard for a while. Alright, we need to know what a prime mover is. So in this figure, this guy is flexing his arm using the biceps muscle, so that in this case the prime mover would be the main muscle causing the contraction. Sometimes it's also called an agonist. A synergist would be a muscle that helps that prime mover, works in synergy to create greater force. And then an antagonist works against the prime mover, and it has to relax in order for that prime mover to do its job. And our muscles are usually arranged in what are called antagonistic pairs. So for example, here you see the biceps brachii will flex the elbow and the triceps brachii will extend the elbow. So during extension, the triceps would be the prime mover and the biceps would be the antagonist. For flexion, it's the opposite. Alright. Next thing is carpal tunnel syndrome. So if we look at the hand, at the cross section, we can see there's a very small tunnel. There's a lot of ligaments running through there, and they form this carpal tunnel where the median nerve goes through. And if there's repetitive motion from your fingers, like it commonly happens from typing, it can also happen from like working in a factory. There's inflammation and swelling in the sheaths around those tendons. It presses on that nerve, and then that's going to cause tingling, weakness, and pain in the fingers. But they can do surgery and take care of it. Then last thing is the effects of exercise. So endurance exercise is going to cause the muscles to produce, so this would be aerobic exercise. It's going to cause the muscle cells to produce more mitochondria and more glycogen in muscles. It's also going to increase the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, so it's going to make more red blood cells. It's going to make our heart more healthy, also makes our bones more healthy, and it's going to allow us to exercise for longer. Resistance exercise, like you see this guy doing, myofibrils grow thicker and increase in number, so your muscles get bigger. So a good exercise program has both endurance and resistance exercises, because